first on. I know. That's great. You're waiting. And I can see there's already some high interest in this particular live, in this particular topic. If you guys are really interested in this topic, by the way, I might even do a full video on this. So let me know if you'd like to have me do a full video on this. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a little bit of a deep dive today on Bayesian reasoning, what's called Bayesian reasoning, Bayes' theorem, but using this, it sounds like a really technical thing, but how to use it in an everyday setting, on an everyday basis, in order to make better decisions, right? In order to make better decisions, in order to, I would say, overcome, for instance, overthinking. Because how often do you, let's say, overthink a decision, or you overthink somebody's behavior towards you, you overthink somebody's intentions or their remarks, or you overthink something somebody said, right? And maybe you always are biased toward negative outcomes as well. Maybe you're always thinking, well, considering the worst outcome, right? And that's what we have. We have negativity bias. In fact, we have so many human beings. We have so many innate cognitive biases, meaning biases to think a certain way regardless of what the actual evidence is. Good morning, Carib 2007. Yeah, so we have certain biases to believe certain things. And so Bayesian reasoning, yes, there are other very technical approaches to, for instance, statistics, probability, decision making, but I find most of those approaches are not simple enough. Oh, it's 8 p.m. Hey, awesome. Well, welcome. 8 p.m. where you are. I find a lot of those really theoretical approaches don't really work for everyday life. And so what I'm going to show you is how to use Bayesian reasoning in our everyday lives to overcome cognitive biases, to overcome overthinking, and all of those things. And I'm actually going to share my screen, I can't share my screen on a live short, but what I can do is see if this works. See if you guys can see this. Yeah, so I'm actually going to have to lower this a little bit. So let's take a look here. This is actually, you know what? I'm actually going to take the phone away from here, and I'm going to lower this out because I don't think it's going to work this way. Okay, so here, let's take a look. This is Bayes' theorem, right? Bayesian, and this is what Bayesian reasoning is based on. And okay, if you're already thinking, oh my gosh, it's math and like it's crazy stuff, all right, don't worry. I'm going to show you how this can actually be very simple to use in everyday life. Okay, so just stay with me because I'm going to teach you all this stuff step by step. We're going to go through it step by step. So just take a deep breath and let's go through it. And if you already know Bayes' law and you already know Bayesian reasoning, then guess what? You're in luck because now we're going to see how to use it in a practical way instead of just a theoretical way. So Bayes' law is really good for several reasons. So here, let's take a look at each part of this equation, right? So the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence. So this is what's called the posterior probability. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this page just because there are lots of terms and stuff. I don't want you to focus so much on the terms. I want you to focus on how to actually use it. Here's the probability of the evidence if the evidence if the hypothesis is true. This is called the likelihood. Okay, and then this is your what's called the prior probability. Okay, let me explain this. The prior probability, this is really the beauty of Bayesian reasoning. Is you might say, well, there are different ways of interpreting evidence, and there are different ways of, different beliefs that people have, and different, and yes, actually, the reason Bayesian reasoning here is so elegant is that it admits, Bayes actually believed that probability, this idea of probability, is totally subjective. It's based on feeling. It's based on your gut feeling. It's based on maybe your personal experience, right? Your personal beliefs. He granted that probability could be based on your personal beliefs, your subjective perspective, and that's really great that we can start with that starting point, right? because everybody has different subjective beliefs. But what this equation helps us do is it helps us channel those subjective beliefs into some way that we can objectively evaluate them. So it's really a beautiful thing. So let's take a look, and we're going to see you can actually start with any belief. That's the beautiful thing. You can start with any belief, right? You're entitled to any belief in Bayes' theorem and any subjective viewpoint that you want in Bayes' theorem. And we just learn how to channel that and harness that. So to make better decisions. So I'll explain how. The probability of the evidence overall. We don't actually end up needing this a lot of the time, as we'll see, because we're just going to take the ratio. How do we make the best decision? I'm going to show you. Again, don't worry about like math and stuff like that. If you're not a math person, it's okay. Don't worry. I'm going to show you how to use this in a really practical way. But at the end of the day, what are we going to do? We're going to have two hypotheses. Let's say, this whatever reality that might be true, and then this bias that we have. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the ratio. And based on the ratio, this is the beauty of it. Based on the ratio, going all the way from a subjective belief to plugging this in and getting a ratio, we're going to, this is based on the number output that we get. It's going to tell us whether our interpretation of what happened is biased or whether it's actually objective. And Akash, I actually do have a book on this. Let me actually go get it. Hold on. It's over here. This is a good book on my bookshelf. It's buried a little bit, so I gotta find it. But there is a good book on this. I would actually recommend this one. If you're beginning in Bayesian stats, Bayesian statistics, I often recommend people read this book, Bayesian Statistics the Fun Way, because it is actually a fun way. He uses a lot of, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but you do have to learn some formulas and things like that in order to really fully understand Bayesian reasoning. But the great thing is you don't have to, there are fun ways and interesting ways of thinking about it. So let's dive into this. Okay, so I'm going to give you this first example. Okay, so here's a scenario. Does this sound familiar? Tell me, anybody, if this sounds familiar, right? You overthink what someone really meant by their behavior, all right? And you're torn between two hypotheses. So, right? So we have two interpretations. So we start with this idea of, what does this person mean by their behavior? It could be anything. They laughed at something, or they said a certain thing, whatever that is, right? With your interaction with someone, you're thinking, did this person, did they mean well, or was it neutral, or did they mean some harm, or did they mean to insult me, or did they mean to be manipulative? So let's look at these two possibilities. Now, in real life, there are more than two possibilities, but just to keep this simple for the explanation, and for most situations in life, I would say, or at least a large number of situations in our lives, there are going to be two possibilities. Either they meant well with a positive intention, or they meant harm. So now, what are we going to do? We're going to assign probabilities to each of these hypotheses. And you might ask, well, how do we assign probabilities to each hypothesis? I don't know, right? Here again is the beauty, and I'm a big fan of what I would call I call it what's called frequentist statistics, which is actually not what Bayes' theorem is about at all. There are different actually interpretations of probability and different schools of thought when it comes to probability. Frequentism is one of them, but Bayesian reasoning, and they're seen as equally valid because they're used in different contexts and different models and stuff like that. So don't worry, this is all valid. But that's the beauty of Bayesian reasoning in particular, is it's so flexible. We don't need to know the specific probability of each hypothesis. We don't need to know the probability of that they have a positive intention or that they were being manipulative. We don't need to know that probability really at all. We kind of just have to assume a ballpark figure, because the way this equation works with the ratios, right? Even an approximation or a ballpark understanding of the probability of each hypothesis will give us a really meaningful result. So let's look at this to see what I mean. So here we define the hypotheses, right? So one is they had a positive intention. When they had that behavior toward us, they have a positive intention. The other, hypothesis, again, we reiterate, it's a negative intention. So now we consider the evidence. Once again, we consider the evidence. Well, what's the evidence? Is they had this vague behavior toward us. They had this negative, maybe, whatever kind of behavior toward us. And we say, well, but there are different interpretations of that evidence. Aha, that's perfect. Perfect, right? You're thinking that, right? Different people interpret evidence in different ways. Again, Bayesian reasoning incorporates this so well, because what's our next step here? We're going to do step 3 here. And again, this is going to be recorded, and if you can't write down all these steps and everything, of course it's recorded, and you can you can catch this on the replay, right, on my channel later, and you can watch it, you can write down the steps, you can and then you can practice it yourself. That's the key. So let's look here. Step 3 is estimating the likelihoods. So estimating the likelihoods. So what does that mean? Now we have what's called it's like a given. It's a probability in the form of a given, like this given that. What's the probability of A? What's the probability of A given B? Whatever. It's okay. I don't want to get too technical. Let's just get on with estimating what are called the likelihoods. So what's the probability they'd behave vaguely if they had positive intentions? We want to assign a probability to that. And let's say here, let's assign a reasonable probability to that, right? So positive intentions, we could say positive intentions, or maybe even neutral intentions. Let's say that. Let's group this together. Positive intentions, so what's the probability they'd behave in this way if they had positive or neutral intentions? Well, assign your probability. Here I assigned a probability of 0.3 or 30%. And here's the thing, you assign your own probability. Assign your own probability. Again, that's the flexibility of it. You don't need a specific probability. You don't need the probability to be 100% right. And that's the coolest thing about Bayes' law and Bayesian reasoning. It's incredible. You don't have to have a precise measurement. It's better if you do have the data, right? But in these kinds of situations, do you have data? Not really. It's like your own subjective experience. So assign a probability to it. And in this case, we're going to assign the probability of 0.3. So why? Why do I say 0.3? Because let's make a fair assessment. When people act vaguely, or they act ambiguously, they might be there might be other possibilities, nervous or distracted. But let's say that's a low probability, right? Let's say that's kind of a low probability. What's more likely, right? The likelihood. Probability they'd behave vaguely if they had negative intentions. Well, that's kind of more likely, right? Because people often act vague or whatever when they're being manipulative or evasive. So we can be pretty objective about that, even though it's just a ballpark figure. I made up 0.3 or 30%, and 0.7 or 70% for the other one, but it's up to you. You could make this 0.2. You could make this 0.8. The other one 0.8. You could make the other one. You could make them closer. One is 0.45. The other one is 0.55. As you'll see, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter how much, how precise you are with this. Daily Trends Roundup, welcome. It doesn't matter how precise you are with this, because at the end of the day, we're going to put this in a ratio, and whatever the ratio is, whatever number is, if it's below 1 or over 1, that's really what matters, and I'll show you in a bit. So you don't have to be precise with these numbers. You don't. That's again the beauty of it. Now, step 4, you really don't have to be precise with these. You really don't. This is what's called your priors. So yeah. So exactly. So Akash, you can set it as your gut feeling, right? Is maybe nervous, right? Only 30% chance, right? Exactly. You can set it kind of like it's a little bit subjective. So you set your priors. This is where you are very subjective, based on your general knowledge or past experience, personally, right? Your not data. This is the amazing thing about this. Once again, not based on data, although it would be great if you do have data. Right? It's better if you do have data, but If you don't have data in your everyday life, which we don't, like living in our everyday lives, we don't have data, and this is why Bayesian reasoning is so useful, because typically you don't have data when you're just going about your life. You don't have time to go research some data, right? You want a tool that you can use right away. So you set your priors. Most people. So let's set the probability of hypothesis 1 as 0.8, right? That most people you interact with have positive intentions. Or the probability that most people have positive intentions as 0.8. Or right, because maybe most of you think, maybe you're really pessimistic and you think, most people don't have positive intentions. I would switch that around. I'd be like 0.2. All right, okay, let's say you're really pessimistic. At least maybe you can admit that most people you interact with have positive or neutral intentions, right? Can we say that at least, that like maybe most people, if you're really pessimistic even, most people don't, it's not reasonable still to say like most people have negative intentions toward you. It's more reasonable to say at least they have neutral intentions. They don't care about you, right? So, KKRS, welcome back to the live stream. So, and then fewer people are actively manipulative. And I think this is a fair assessment, right? 0.8, 0.2 here, right? So now what do we do? So now you write down these numbers, you have a ballpark figure, and what we're now going to do is we're going to do what's called compute the posterior ratio. Remember the probability of, so the posterior ratio, let's go all the way back, right? Go all the way back. This is the posterior, right? The posterior probability. What does that mean? It means what is the probability of the hypothesis that I have, right? Given the evidence, right, that I see. What is the probability given the evidence? And then we conclude, right? Remember we put all these together that, right? Let's go back to the probability 0.3. What's the 0.3 again? 0.3 is that the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis. Meaning, what's the probability, right? Again, that I see what I see if, let's say, the person is distracted, nervous, neutral. What's the probability of the behavior here that I see when people are manipulative? Well, again, it's a lot higher. So we incorporate those two into the equation here, 0.3, 0.7, right? Now, what are the other two numbers again? We remind ourselves, right? This is the probability just of the hypothesis itself, 0.8 and 0.2, okay? So here you might, well, actually, I won't be more technical than this. Basically, once again, you can find this on the recording. Don't worry so you can take notes on this for sure. But you could go back to the recording, of course, the replay of this, and you can, you can practice this yourself. You can take notes on it yourself, right? Really, I think quite useful. So, 0.3 times 0.8 over 0.7 times 0.2. You see how actually what's going to happen? You end up with a ratio of 1.71, right? What does this mean now? How do we interpret this? So the interpretation is the ratio is 1.71, meaning that after observing the evidence, it's still about 1.7 times more likely that they meant well than that meant harm. So here, how could you interpret this? Right? 1.71, so if it's over 1, if the ratio, the number we spit out here is 1 or, well, if it's 1, we have a problem. But anyway, I won't discuss that, because if it's 1, then it's equally probable. But barring that, that's not likely to happen, actually. But if it's more than 1, what do we have? We end up saying that, okay, the hypothesis of the hypothesis 1, given our evidence, is actually the most probable then, right? Meaning that, even though the evidence leans toward a negative intention, right? That's the beauty of it. It leans toward a negative intention. Your strong prior belief that most people mean well keeps positive intention as the more probable explanation. In other words, it's more probable what? That you're overthinking the whole damn thing, right? At the end of the day, you are overthinking the whole thing. Actually, you know what? Daily Trends Roundup. I might actually just put these slides. Let me see what I can do. I think if I can put the slides somewhere in a link or something like that.
Or at least just put the formulas or something like that in there. I could do that possibly. Let me look into that. But good thought there. So here's the thing: if it's more than one, let's get to the breakdown here. If it's more than one, then your probability of hypothesis one given the evidence is stronger, is greater. If it's less than one, if you end up with a number less than one, the probability of hypothesis two is stronger. Meaning, if it were less than one, if we ended up with something less than one, what it would mean is probability the hypothesis two, meaning like that they actually meant harm, that their behavior actually meant harm to us, was intended as harmful. That would be more reasonable, right? Do you see how this whole process is so helpful for avoiding bias and overthinking? Because do you see here again how beautiful this is in a way? Because you don't need precise numbers. Because look, even if I hadn't raised these a little bit, if I had made this 0.45 and I made this 0.55, right? Do you see how, if I had made these higher or closer to each other, we still would end up with a ratio greater than 1, right? It doesn't matter really how accurate you are. You just kind of need to be in a reasonable ballpark, and this is a great way to avoid bias. So here's the conclusion here, or here's another scenario, and I don't know if I have time to go through the whole scenario, but I'll go through this kind of faster. So let's say you automatically focus on the negatives when making decisions and dismiss positives as irrelevant. So again, we're going to model this as competing hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 is the situation is genuinely risky or negative. Hypothesis 2 is the situation is more balanced or even positive, but you're filtering reality. Like you have a negative bias, right? Okay, and then you observe the evidence such as what? Noticing flaws or drawbacks in the opportunity. So for instance, you might notice some red flags. Okay, you might notice, and this is good. I mean, this is good for like anything, relationships, right? A business opportunity, an educational opportunity. So now we're going to break this down because you notice flaws, right? This example is helpful specifically because we want to know how reasonable is my assessment of those flaws, or am I just hyper focusing on these flaws and being totally biased in the process of over focusing on these flaws? How much should I weigh these flaws? Well, again, Bayes' theorem has the solution. It has the solution, right? So we define the hypotheses once again. Hypothesis 1 is the situation is actually negative. There are real risks. Hypothesis 2 is the situation is, let's say, neutral or positive, but your attention is biased, right? You are biased. So step 2, we consider the evidence. Once again, what's the evidence? You notice several drawbacks or flaws, right? Again, just flaws, right? And again, we're always gonna notice flaws. I mean, that's true, right? There are flaws, as you can look very, very hard at anything, and you will find flaws. Isn't that true? So we want to know how to weigh those flaws. Well, step 3 is we estimate the likelihoods. These are again called the likelihoods. So the likelihoods are, what is the evidence? What is the probability of seeing that evidence if a situation is genuinely negative? In other words, what's the probability that you would notice those flaws if the situation is genuinely negative? Well, I would put that high, right? 90%, right? Isn't that true? Hey again, Nikhil. Yeah, I will get back to comments, by the way. I know a lot of people commented on stuff recently. I've been a little busy, but I will get back to all your comments and everything. So, but that's true, right? Would you agree with me? Do you think that's reasonable that if the situation is genuinely negative, noticing flaws is pretty likely? Yeah, right? Okay, so how about this? Okay, yeah, sorry, I was interrupted. So what is the likelihood? What is the likelihood that the situation is fine, but you're biased toward negatives? You might notice the flaws. right? You might still notice flaws. Well, it's a little bit lower, right? And then again, we said our priors assume you've recognized your negativity bias. So you think, okay, situations are genuinely negative 30% of the time. And then situations are neutral or positive 70% of the time, right? Again, we have to consider that negative situations, things are negative maybe 30% of the time, right? Again, it's context dependent. It's context dependent, which is why Bayes' theorem, maybe things in life, in your life, end up being very, very negative a lot of the time. It could be. Some people have very difficult lives, right? But you would update your priors based on that. It's a little complex, more of a complex situation, but let's just say it's more likely that situations on the whole are typically neutral or positive, right? Okay, so let's take a look again. We're going to compute the ratios again. Again, this is recorded. You can go back and look, but what actually is the probability of each one? Right? The probability of each one is 0.27. And then of this one, of hypothesis 1, given the evidence, not just hypothesis 1, but hypothesis 1 given the evidence. The probability of hypothesis 2 given the evidence is 0.42. I see, Nikhil. Yeah, well, guess what? I also have flaws in my thinking because I'm human too, right? In case you haven't noticed, right? We all are. So look, in this case, we have something that's less than 1. We have something that's less than 1. So what does that mean? It means that the probability of hypothesis 1 given the evidence is what? It's less likely. This one is more likely. Obviously, we can even just see that from here, but the ratio is 0.64, right? It means it's more likely that the situation is fine, but your bias is exaggerating the negatives, right? So look at that. And you might say, okay, after all this, you might say, well, I don't have time to calculate all that on the fly. Like if I'm just out somewhere. And that's true. So there are two solutions to this. One is you can definitely use this. Let's say if you're overthinking chronically, or let's say you have, you notice you're always negative towards something, or right? Yes, you can sit down. You actually can sit down and take some time. It might take 5-10 minutes maybe to set this out and calculate this, right? So you can actually sit down and do that as an exercise for yourself. And just whatever it spits out as the result, it can help you stay more grounded in reality, right? So you can take 5 to 10 minutes to do something like this. You can, right? And you could cheat, right? You could follow some steps. You could have them written down somewhere, right? No problem with that. You can write down the steps. You can follow each step, right? When you're feeling overwhelmed or something like that, and actually use this. Another thing you can do is you can just roughly reason this out. Okay, you can just roughly reason it out if you are on the go. If you're not somewhere you can like do a calculation or write stuff out, you can actually use this just on the fly, on the go reasoning, right? And just make some estimations. And that alone can often really, really help you. So I actually think, I love Bayesian reasoning, again, just because it's so practical. It's, again, I am a big proponent of both frequentist statistics, frequentist probability, and, subjective probability. I like both concepts. I think both are valid. If not actually somewhat contradictory, but both valid nonetheless. Read maybe Derrida and the problems that the structuralist philosophers had to understand that more fully. But I think they're both valid. But Bayesian probability, Bayesian statistics is really, really helpful here, and hopefully you can see that. Let me show the book one more time. That you can read to get a better, if you really want to take a deep dive into Bayesian statistics, but learn it in kind of a fun way. And if you're kind of a beginner with it and you want some stuff that's not too advanced, I have the book right here that's really helpful. It's called Bayesian Statistics the Fun Way
Bayesian Statistics the Fun Way. I actually will talk about this book a little bit more in an upcoming video as well. Who's the author again? Will Kurtz. Will Kurt is the author. I know it's a little small, but you can actually see that. And man, I think that if you learn how to reason well, right, you can make a lot better decisions. But also, not just how to reason well, like learn when also to, and this is a whole different video, but learn how to train your intuition, to train your instinct and intuition, okay? That's very key as well. It's very, very key. How to do that? Again, another video. But there is some evidence that things like what's called reward prediction error, which is how our brain, spots opportunities and danger and things like that, has a lot to do with Bayesian reasoning, and is somewhat modeled on a Bayesian model. So, which is interesting. But anyway, that's a whole rabbit hole, and more for discussion next time. Guys, feel free to, if you like all this stuff, feel free to check out my Critical Thinking Academy. Feel free to check out my Discord group. Chat group. You can chat me up anytime. Feel free to reach out to me by email with questions, comments, just to chat. I'm always happy to. And then also feel free to subscribe and watch all my videos. So I appreciate you guys. I will see you on the next live stream. Take care.